I spent 12 years hating a man I had never once spoken to, and then I spent 3 years living in his house, sleeping under his roof, loving his children as if they were my own. My name is Sydney. I'm 25, and the most powerful man in Austria is also the man who murdered my father. If you believe in second chances, forgiveness, and kindness, this story is definitely for you. My father, Stephen, was a carpenter by trade, and for a period of his life, he rarely spoke about openly something far more dangerous. Long before I understood any of it, he had crossed paths with a rising criminal figure named Gustavo, and whatever damage passed between them during those years apparently cut deep enough that Gustavo never forgot it. I was 13 years old the night Gustavo came to collect on that old debt. I remember very little of it directly, only fragments. My mother pulling me down into the basement, her hand pressed hard over my mouth, both of us frozen in the dark while sounds moved through the floorboards above us that I have spent the rest of my life trying not to fully remember. When it finally went quiet, we stayed hidden for what felt like hours. Gustavo found us eventually. He opened the basement door, and I remember looking up at him through the darkness, a man whose face I would recognize anywhere for the rest of my life. He looked at my mother, he looked at me, and then, for reasons I never understood until much later, he simply turned and left. He didn't touch either of us. He walked out of that house and never came back. My mother never fully recovered from that night. She raised me alone afterward, worked herself into exhaustion, and died when I was 18, worn down by grief she never let herself properly grieve. I left our old house within the month, unable to stay inside walls that still held that particular silence, and took the only work I could find that didn't require credentials I couldn't afford. I became a babysitter, moving between families across the city, building a quiet, anonymous life that asked nothing of my past. For 7 years, I told myself I had made peace with what happened. I hadn't. I had simply buried it somewhere I didn't have to look at directly, the way you learn to walk around a hole in familiar flooring without ever actually repairing it. Gustavo's wife died 4 years ago, during the birth of their son, John. I didn't know this at the time. I didn't know anything about Gustavo's life during those years, hadn't allowed myself to track his name in the news the way some part of me occasionally wanted to. I found out only after the fact, when his assistant, a quiet, careful man named Otto, appeared at the small apartment I rented, asking questions about my work history that felt, at the time, oddly thorough for a simple babysitting inquiry. I later learned that Gustavo had asked Otto to look into families who might understand what his children were going through, families touched by loss the way his own household now was. Somewhere in that search, my name surfaced. Whether he recognized it immediately or only afterward, I never fully knew. What I do know is that 3 weeks later, Gustavo himself appeared at my apartment door. I nearly didn't open it. 12 years of quiet, buried rage rose up the instant I saw his face through the peephole. Older now, grayer at the temples, dressed like a businessman rather than the shadow I remembered from that basement. But something, curiosity or exhaustion, or simply 12 years of carrying something too heavy to carry alone any longer, made me open the door anyway. He didn't try to hide who he was or pretend the past didn't exist between us. He stood in my doorway and said plainly that he knew exactly what he had taken from me, that he had thought about that night more times than he could count over the past 12 years, and that he had come not to ask forgiveness because he understood that wasn't his to request, but to offer honest work, fair pay, and full transparency about who he was asking it of. I told him to leave. I meant it completely in that moment. He left without argument. But over the following days, something in me kept circling back to the strange, unexpected honesty of that visit. Most people who'd done what he'd done would have hidden it or offered some hollow explanation designed to make themselves feel better. He hadn't done either. He had simply told the truth and let me decide what to do with it. I said yes 3 weeks later, not because I had forgiven him and not because the anger had disappeared, but because I needed steady work badly enough. And because some part of me, the part I understood least at the time, wanted to look this man in the eye regularly enough to finally stop being afraid of the shape he'd taken in my memory. I moved into his estate on the edge of the city within the month. His children, Georgia, 7 years old, and John, 4, were quiet and watchful at first, the particular caution of children who'd already learned that people around them sometimes disappeared without warning. It took weeks before Georgia would speak to me directly. It took nearly 2 months before John stopped flinching whenever I raised my voice, even gently, even in play. I threw myself into caring for them with an intensity I didn't fully examine until much later. Perhaps it was guilt, working through Gustavo's children as a way of processing what I couldn't say to Gustavo directly. Perhaps it was simply that Georgia and John needed exactly the kind of steady, patient presence I'd once needed myself and never fully received after my mother's death. Whatever the reason, within a year, both children loved me completely, and I loved them just as fully in return. Gustavo, for his part, remained largely formal with me during those early years, professional and careful, as though he understood that anything more familiar would have felt like an intrusion I hadn't invited. He watched from a respectful distance as his children slowly came back to life under my care. The desperate, hollow quality that had settled into the household after his wife's death gradually softened into something resembling an ordinary, functioning family, one I had somehow become the quiet center of. The trouble started small, the way these things usually do. One afternoon, while helping the children finish their schoolwork, I kissed each of them on the forehead after they'd completed their tests, an unconscious habit I developed over the years without fully noticing it. John looked up at me afterward with an expression I hadn't seen from him before, something between confusion and quiet longing. "I wish you were my mommy," he said. I didn't know what to say. John had no real memory of his actual mother, only the absence she'd left behind, and something about the moment his small face turned up toward mine undid something in my chest I wasn't prepared for. When I looked up, Gustavo was standing in the doorway. He'd clearly heard everything. Neither of us said a word. The moment simply passed, unresolved, the way difficult moments sometimes do, when no one knows quite what to say. It should have ended there. It didn't. A week later, we were looking through an old family photo album in the children's playroom, Gustavo reading quietly nearby, when a photograph of his late wife appeared. Standing alone in soft afternoon light, John pointed excitedly between the photo and me. "She looks just like you," he said. Then, with the particular certainty only small children seem to possess, "I think you're her. I think you're my mom, and you're just tricking me by saying she's dead." Gustavo and I looked up at exactly the same moment. Our eyes met across the room, and for several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Both of us apparently equally unprepared for how quickly this had escalated from a passing comment into something neither of us knew how to correct. Gustavo finally sent the children to the hall to play with their pet parrot, and once we were alone, he turned to me with an expression somewhere between concern and quiet urgency. "I need to understand what's happening," he said. "John hasn't been himself for 2 weeks. Georgia," he turned toward his daughter, who'd lingered in the doorway, "have you been telling him things about Sydney and his mother?" Georgia's face crumpled instantly. "I swear, sir, I haven't said anything. He's saying it all on his own. I promise I'm not lying." Tears slid down her face, genuine and frightened, and Gustavo's expression softened immediately, his concerns shifting away from suspicion the moment he saw how deeply the accusation had wounded her. He said nothing more and left the room, clearly needing time to think. I remained behind with Georgia, unsure what exactly I was supposed to feel in that moment, guilt or confusion or something closer to a grief I hadn't fully processed since my own mother's death. Minutes later, we heard John's voice from the hallway. "Daddy, I know Sydney is my mommy. You're all lying to me." I heard Gustavo's silence stretch on, longer than felt bearable. When he finally answered, his voice carried none of the frustration I might have expected. Instead, it was quiet, deliberate, almost resigned. "Yes," he said. "She is your mother. I was lying to you." I stood frozen in the playroom, completely unprepared for what I'd just heard. Georgia stared at her father, equally stunned, though she said nothing. That night, once John was finally asleep, Gustavo asked Georgia gently how she truly felt about me. Georgia answered without hesitation, telling him that after him, I was the only person she genuinely loved, that I had cared for both of them the way she imagined a real mother would, patient and present in a way that had slowly rebuilt something in their small, fractured family that she'd assumed was permanently broken. Gustavo sent her to bed and called for me shortly afterward. When I entered his study, my face still carried whatever grief had been building all evening. He noticed I could tell, but he didn't ask directly what had caused it. "Do you love John and Georgia?" he asked instead. "Yes," I said. "In my entire life, they're the only ones I truly love." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before, something closer to genuine uncertainty than the composed authority he usually carried. "Would you consider being their mother?" he asked. "Officially, would you marry me?" I stood completely still, certain I'd misheard him. When I finally found words, they came out smaller than I intended. Sir, I don't understand. I'm not asking out of anything beyond what I've already told you, he said carefully. You are the only person my children have loved fully since their mother died. I'm asking so that bond can never be questioned or taken from them, so they never have to fear losing you the way they have already lost so much. You're a powerful man, I said quietly. I'm a babysitter you hired out of guilt. We aren't equals. Something shifted in his expression, a rare crack in the composed exterior he'd maintained since the day he first appeared at my door. You are more than equal to me, he said. Whatever I've built, whatever power people believe I hold, none of it changes what I did to your family. I've spent 12 years unable to fully forgive myself for that night, Sydney. I don't say that expecting it to undo anything. I say it because you deserve to know that the guilt was never something I managed to outrun, no matter how far I built myself from who I used to be. Wealth and title mean nothing beside what's true inside a person. You have more integrity in you than I've held in my entire life, both before that night and every year since. I felt something break loose inside my chest. 12 years of carefully buried grief finally finding somewhere to land. I understood standing there that I had spent over a decade waiting, without fully realizing it, for someone connected to that night to finally say exactly what he just said. If this brings John and Georgia closer to the family they deserve, I finally said, then I have no objection. You gave me shelter and purpose when I had neither. I won't pretend that erases what happened, but I've watched you become someone genuinely trying to be better. Every single day I've lived in this house. That has to count for something. Thank you, Gustavo said quietly. I know I can't offer you the love I once gave my wife, but I promise you'll be safe here and you'll be happy for as long as I have any power to make that true. We married quietly the following week in a small courtroom ceremony that no one outside the household knew about except Georgia, who could barely contain her happiness. John had already fully accepted, in his own simple, unquestioning way, that I was now officially his mother. Both children began calling me Mom within days, the words settling into our household as though it had always belonged there. The marriage, built on guilt and grief and a complicated history neither of us could fully undo, slowly became something neither of us expected. Gustavo remained careful and respectful, giving me space to grieve what I needed to grieve, never once pressuring me toward feelings I wasn't ready to offer. Over the following months, something quiet and unforced began growing between us, built not on the violence of our shared history, but on the small, ordinary moments of raising two children together. Bedtime stories, shared worry over school projects, the particular exhaustion and joy of parenthood neither of us had expected to find with the other. I think most nights now about that basement, about the moment Gustavo opened the door and chose, for reasons I understood only years later, to leave my mother and me alive rather than finish what he'd started. I used to believe that choice meant nothing, a random mercy from a man who felt none of it. I understand now it was the first small crack in the person he would eventually become, the first moment where something in him refused to complete the violence he'd been raised inside. I never fully forgot what he took from me. I don't think I ever will, but I've come to understand that some debts aren't repaid through justice or punishment. Sometimes they're repaid slowly, through years of quiet, consistent choice. A man rebuilding himself daily in the hope that someone he wronged might eventually see the person he's become, rather than only the person he once was. I found a family in the last place I ever expected to find one, inside the home of the man who destroyed my first family completely. Some mornings, watching Georgia and John laugh together over breakfast, Gustavo quietly reading beside them, I catch myself thinking that grief and forgiveness were never truly opposites at all. They simply learned, slowly and against every expectation I once held, how to live inside the same house together.